Today I would like to address the relation between archive and canon, thinking specifically about the way that television strands are handled in the archiving process. This paper is drawn from my experience undertaking a PhD with Royal Holloway and the British Film Institute on Play for Today at its 50th birthday. As part of this collaborative doctoral award, I was fortunate enough to work closely with the BFI in curating an exhibition about Play for Today, as well as co-programming the South Bank season Play for Today at 50. It's a pleasure to be back here today, albeit in a very different capacity. Firstly, I wish to talk about my experience of curating the exhibition. The Play for Today at 50 exhibition was a collaboration between the BFI and the BBC and was initially intended for the South Bank mezzanine gallery above the box office, centred around 4 thematic cases. Sadly, COVID-19 had other plans, and the exhibition was to be moved online. Planning for a physical space undoubtedly shaped the exhibition, not least because the focus on images, stills, behind-the-scenes production shots and similar, remains central aspects, perhaps more central than they would have been on a website ordinarily. To retrieve these images necessarily required extensive exploration in the photo archives, from the BBC Archive Centre to the BFI Berkhamsted Special Collections to the digitised collections of both institutions. Planning an exhibition on the beloved Play for Today strand was not straightforward. Play for Today, for those unaware, is a strand comprised of 316 television plays which ran from 1970 to 1984 on BBC One. Due to the focus of today's event, I don't have time to explore the question of how decisions can be made about how to best represent such a large body of work pictorially, which plays to represent and which plays to implicitly sideline. What I can focus on, though, is the role that archives played in forcing the hand when making such decisions, and how the way we archive, talk about, and conceptualize television strands implies a certain way of working for curators as well as theorists. The most immediate way that archives shaped my interaction with Play for Today's images was simply the lack, in most instances, of a Play for Today archive altogether. If I wanted to find, for example, an image of the Rank and File, a classic Jim Allen Ken Loach Play for Today from 1971, more often than not I found myself having to search through a Ken Loach collection, sometimes a Jim Allen collection. There are numerous reasons for and numerous problems with this fact. A reason for this method of organising the archives is that a strand cannot be conflated with a series. In most cases, a series is something with at least a degree of diegetic continuity. Its worlds, if not most of its characters, are returned to from episode to episode. Or, in the case of something like an anthology series, confusingly a term I would argue is misapplied to Play for Today, the diegeses may vary, but there is typically some continuity on the level of writers, directors, and producers, as well as theme, style, and so on. Play for Today has none of these typical commonalities of a series, making it something else, a strand. Every week, its viewers were transported to a different world in a different place and a different time, with a story written, directed, and produced by someone different. From a position of relative unfamiliarity, it might be reasonable to assume that Play for Today is nothing more than a slot. Another reason for organising the archive this way is that the strand's official contents are not something that consensus has been reached on. The figure I provided earlier of 316 plays is contentious, for this number includes works made prior to Play for Today's creation as a strand, which were made for other spheres of television and rebroadcast as part of Play for Today. The reason I provide for this is that once a work becomes part of Play for Today, it is part of Play for Today. Even nominally, it's shaped the strand's meanings, its future, and its perception. But other theorists provide other numbers. Tom May argues for 298 plays, and numerous other figures recur through scholarship. So if we cannot decide definitively what is and what is not Play for Today, forming a Play for Today archive becomes a difficult task. But a difficult task is not an impossible task, and I now wish to make the case for why archivists as well as theorists should take the role of reunifying a strand currently in pieces, an urgent one. My argument mainly comprises of 2 parts. One is the perpetuation of the Play for Today canon, and another is the loss of a sense of what Play for Today is. Firstly, I will describe the relationship as I observed it between the Play for Today canon and the disunity of the Play for Today archive. Unfortunately, there is a certain theme to the names associated with Play for Today, as well as the most famous names attached to the strand. The former is characterised by whiteness and maleness. The latter allows for news titles like Dame Helen Mirren and Sir Anthony Hopkins appear in unseen snaps from Play for Today as BBC celebrate the show's 50th anniversary, to totally shift the focus away from the strand's socio-political nature. The predominance of critical reflections on Play for Today that seem to suggest that the strand was a boys' club were rife pre-2020, while I was working on the exhibition. John Hill perceives that the bulk of writing on Play for Today has occurred somewhat tangentially in works mainly devoted to the careers of individual producers, directors, and writers, listing the following names as those fortunate enough to receive attention: Alan Bennett, Alan Clark, Tony Garnett, Trevor Griffiths, Barry Hines, Mike Lee, Dennis Potter, and Jack Rosenthal. This systematic erasure of the work by women and people of colour for the strand not only reduces the diversity of creators who are remembered, but crucially also the variety of aesthetic modes, themes and styles adopted in Play for Today. Dividing archives by creator makes the task of nuancing this narrow understanding of the strand very difficult, not only because the person using the archive needs to know the name they are searching for and have that name associated with Play for Today, rather than simply stumbling across a play or a still while browsing a Play for Today archive, but also not all writers, directors, producers, or actors even have their own collection to start with. This has a circular effect. Curators and theorists using these systems are less likely to stumble upon a forgotten Play for Today, thus are less likely to draw public attention to it, therefore the image or play continues to be unlikely to be found. Secondly, the more Play for Today is divided in archives, the harder it is as a curator or a theorist to reconstruct a perception of Play for Today as a strand, with a certain unity implicit. In order to draw meaningful connections between works in the strand which thematically overlap and to understand its role socially, politically, and aesthetically, the strand cannot be seen as a mere sum of its constituent parts. Through the physical process of sifting through archives, which might be thought of as benign or not thought of at all, apart from, obviously, by all of us, because otherwise we wouldn't be here, ideas about the object of one's research or retrieval are in the making. Encountering a Play for Today archive versus having to search for traces of Play for Today in individualised collections are two very different experiences, inevitably constructing different ways of seeing the strand, if not rendering it invisible altogether. Fundamentally, a great deal of my research rests on the assumption that the only way to meaningfully engage with Play for Today, with its own ontology and cultural resonance rather than a collection of plays that happen to be commissioned under the same banner, is to reconceptualise the strand holistically in discourse and in archive. This would facilitate those using the materials or ideas in question to draw connections between works, to analyse overarching themes and modes, to study the contributions of individuals as they recurred, stopped and started in the strand's history, to understand that history and to evaluate how the Play for Today canon is an exertion of ideology over text, creating hierarchies, value judgments and exclusions that might not align with our own sensibilities. Through the strand, the approaching of issues of the day from multiple perspectives could thrive. Sexual violence could be explored via a tale of wartime torture, the perils of the nation-state, and the ineffectuality of overly diplomatic cross-border human rights NGOs on No Visible Scar. In Sorry, sexual violence could be explored through the examination of the entrapment of working-class women in social, sexual, and economic subordination. And then the inability to escape such violence through individualistic methods of social climbing could be explored through Do As I Say, each play building on the last and creating a multi-dimensional look at an intricate web of power and the brutal exertion of that power, taking extraordinary cases and bitterly ordinary ones, and drawing out social truths otherwise difficult to perceive through ideology and through individuated representations of deeply structural issues. Likewise, my research looks across the strand to report where the term sentimental occurs in critical responses to individual plays. My comparative findings unveiled critics' discomfort with empathising across difference, allowing for an understanding in turn of Play for Today as a site of radical use of what I refer to as the sentimental mode, an aesthetic mode equipped to foster solidarity among viewers. These findings were accessible only via looking across and around the canon rather than through it, a task divided archives make harder. Re-canonising is an act which inherently creates new hierarchies and exclusions, appeals to notions of social consensus and power which rest upon dominant ideological structures, and continues the perception of the Play for Today strand as fragmented and dispersed. The film and television canons and their protectors feature their own defensive systems against the eradication of film or television, and insistency that it not only be taken seriously, but preserved at all. This is a tangible concern. 30 plays for today are lost, unwatchable. But if a canon-oriented archive cannot be relied upon to preserve works even within such a prestigious strand, one might make the claim that for all intents and purposes, other archival protections must be implemented. Paul Schrader asks, as the sun finally sets on the century of cinema, by what criteria do we determine its masterworks? Half a century after Play for Today began, I do not wish to pull out its masterworks, as if they are the key to understanding the strand, and it cannot be the archivist's role to define and thus protect only masterworks. Canons are not the key to understanding film or television, merely the key to understanding what the dominant social order would like or begrudgingly permit its subjects to glean from film or television. Thinking across the strand, analysing the mechanics of television strands and the way the format enabled plays within Play for Today to put down themes and pick them up again across diegeses allows us to fully comprehend the unique capacities strands have for the proliferation of radical mass art. Only decanonising, I argue, can liberate Play for Today and allow its good, its bad, and its ugly to be truly accessible to the publics it was made for. To decanonise the strand and its archive means not only to reorganise and rethink the canon as we scholars and curators might access it, but to open access to this newly invigorated archive. To decanonise is to see Play for Today back in the hands of the people. The BFI Mediatek is an exemplar model for this kind of action. Its digitised Play for Today collection, while incomplete, offers over 100 plays completely free to the public, not managed into sections or divided by creator or even year. Instead, the viewer is free to draw their own links between plays, to investigate across theme or by genre, or however they should wish. The collection additionally makes no distinction between canonised plays, by Loach, Potter or Lee, for example, and all but forgotten titles. They're all presented equal, with just as much information available about each play, just like the public would have seen Play for Today upon broadcast. This was of particular urgency pre-2020, in an era where seeing Play for Today was almost inaccessible, save for its DVD releases, which only accounted for around 20% of the strand's plays and featured 0% of plays written by women. Now it is up to us to think of new ways of increasing access to archives like this to people who do not have a local mediatek and encourage meaningful engagement with Play for Today as the varied strand it is produced for the people. Speaking of the people Play for Today and its predecessor, the Wednesday play served, producer Tony Garnett stated in 2016 that television was watched avidly by almost everyone. Millions like my family wouldn't ever think of going to the theatre. That was for other people. But week after week, we had the opportunity to speak to millions. I saw it as an almost sacred responsibility. Play for Today's resonance, aesthetically as well as politically, speaks to a contemporary audience vividly and passionately. We have an opportunity to reunite these works with the kinds of publics that they were intended for, half a century later, and we would do the strand and the institutions we represent a disservice not to take it. Thank you. There's definitely an overlap between the kinds of names that recur in the plays that are lost, but there's also a big correlation with them being part of early Play for Today. So it's kind of a mixture of things, really. But in terms of the quality of them, I can definitely attest to, having read some of the scripts and kind of had a look at the stills and things like that, that there's some work that looks extraordinary that's been lost. There's one of a very small amount of plays written by a black author that was lost as one of the 30. And there was also a play lost that was written by a playwright who went on to be relatively prolific, but was a student at the time, who won a writing competition to actually get the script made. So, yeah, I definitely think that there is something in that losing, which is telling. it's kind of interesting. It was really my work on sexual violence in the Strand which kind of led me to a mass discovery of extraordinary writers especially, but also producers, directors, actors, who were women and who have been kind of written out of the history of play for today, especially Carol Bunyan, but also Rosemary Davis, Gilly Fraser, and then there's more famous names like Carol Churchill and Julia Jones that people also tend not to associate with play for today for whatever reason. But in terms of my work on sentimentality, yes, so I did find that it was kind of interesting because when I started to work on sentimentality, there was a focus on retrieving work that centered female actors of colour, because it was, I wouldn't say that aesthetically speaking, the sentimental mode is something which necessarily correlates with authorship, so the identity of authorship. I kind of expected work written by women to be, more typically thought of as sentimental, and it definitely was written about in that way. A lot of extremely unsentimental plays were called sentimental by critics at the time and things like that, but actually a lot of the sentimental work was written by especially kind of Barry Keefe, Colin Welland and people like that. But often when it was seen as sentimental, its protagonist would be someone who was marginalised. So it's kind of interesting unpicking that and kind of thinking about how femininity has been associated with sentimentality. But I think my rethinking of sentimentality has shown that a lot of work that we don't think of as sentimental shares a sentimentality that isn't necessarily feminine. Sorry, that's a very roundabout way of saying that I think some of Trevor Griffith's work is very sentimental. But yeah, thank you. Interesting questions. Yeah, they are, as we know, nowhere in the world. So yeah, totally lost. No barely watchable VHS recordings, nothing. When I started my PhD, I was very much adamant that I would find these. I don't think I will, which is really sad. It was an era of television where things just got chucked. It's really sad.